The year is 1943, the month is May, and for the once mighty Axis forces, the end is near. This is the story of the last stand in Tunisia, a tale of desperation, delusion, and the tragic human cost of a war already lost. Imagine the scene. 250,000 soldiers, a mix of hardened German veterans from the legendary Afrika Korps and their Italian allies, are trapped. Their backs are to the Mediterranean Sea, and an iron ring of Allied forces is tightening around them on the Tunisian peninsula. These were the same men who, just months earlier, stood at the gates of Egypt, their panzers striking fear into the heart of the British Empire. Now, they were a shadow of their former selves. The numbers paint a grim picture, roughly 275,000 troops. But this wasn't a cohesive fighting army anymore. They were scattered into defensive pockets, holding out in rocky hills and dusty wadis. Their supply situation was beyond critical. Ammunition was counted by the bullet, not by the crate. The fuel tanks of their remaining tanks and vehicles were bone dry, rendering them little more than static steel coffins. Food was so scarce that soldiers were on starvation-leveled rations, their bodies racked with hunger and disease. Morale, once sky-high, had plummeted into a deep, collective despair. Looking up, the skies offered no hope. They were a constant, terrifying blue, but not because of the weather. Allied air superiority was absolute. Swarms of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and American P-40 Warhawks owned the air. Every German truck that dared to move, every desperate attempt to dig a new trench, was spotted from above, and once spotted, it was mercilessly attacked. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of German power, was nowhere to be seen. Any attempt to resupply the trapped army by air or by sea was a suicide mission. With Allied planes and Royal Navy ships sinking transports with chilling regularity, the soldiers on the ground were utterly, terrifyingly alone. The logic of the situation was undeniable to everyone on the ground, from the lowest-ranking private to the most senior generals. The North African campaign was over. The only sane course of action was to surrender, to save the lives of the men who remained. But hundreds of miles away, in his heavily fortified Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, one man saw a completely different reality. Adolf Hitler refused to accept defeat. For Hitler, Tunisia was not a lost cause. It wasn't a death trap. In his mind, it was a bridgehead, a vital strategic foothold in Africa. He clung to the delusion that by holding this small patch of land, his forces could somehow bog down the Allies, disrupt their plans, and delay the inevitable invasion of Europe. He issued stringently clear orders. Old de line, fight to the last man, to the last bullet. There would be no evacuation, no retreat, no surrender. This order was, in effect, a death sentence. It placed the commanders on the ground in an impossible position. Their military training, their strategic sense, and their duty to their men screamed that surrender was the only option. But their orders from the highest authority demanded they sacrifice their troops for a strategic fantasy. There was no grand purpose to their fight anymore. They weren't defending a critical fortress or buying time for a larger counterattack. They were simply ordered to die, pointlessly, to satisfy a delusion being nurtured in a distant bunker. For the soldiers trapped in the Tunisian pocket, this disconnect between their reality and Hitler's orders was a source of profound bitterness. Each sunrise brought not a glimmer of hope, but the certainty of more shelling, more air attacks, and more friends dying for nothing. They listened to the Allied propaganda broadcasts, which promised good treatment and an end to the fighting. They saw the hopelessness of their own position with their own eyes. Yet, they were bound by an oath and a command structure that demanded they continue this futile struggle. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander of Army Group Africana, and his Italian counterpart, General Giovanni Messe, did their best to manage the collapse. They tried to orchestrate localized defenses, to conserve what little they had. But it was like trying to patch 100 holes in a sinking ship with only your hands. The Allied offensive, codenamed Operation Vulcan, was a relentless hammer blow. British, American, and French forces pushed forward, capturing key hills and strategic towns. One by one, the German and Italian lines didn't just bend, they shattered. The psychological toll was immense. These were soldiers who had been fed a narrative of German invincibility an Aryan superiority for years. They had been told they were part of a 1,000-year Reich that was destined to rule the world. Now, they were being systematically crushed by an enemy that had more of everything. More men, more tanks, more planes, more food, more hope. The collapse in Tunisia wasn't just a military defeat. It was the shattering of an entire worldview. Think of the young soldier, perhaps barely 20 years old, huddled in a foxhole. He hasn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. The constant drone of Allied aircraft is a permanent feature of his existence. His ammunition is almost gone. His comrades are being killed or captured all around him. He knows, with absolute certainty, that he cannot win. He knows he will likely die here, in the dust of a foreign land, thousands of miles from home. And for what? So that a leader, completely detached from his suffering, can pretend a bridgehead still exists. It's a level of despair that is difficult for us to fully comprehend. As the first week of May passed, the perimeter shrank relentlessly. The major cities of Tunis and Bizerte fell to the Allies. This cut off the last remaining ports, sealing the fate of any who might have still dreamed of a seaborne escape. What followed was not a single grand surrender, but a chaotic, piecemeal disintegration. Entire units, having run out of ammunition and food, simply ceased to exist as fighting formations. Men began surrendering in droves, walking towards the Allied lines with their hands held high, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. On May 13th, 1943, it was all over. General von Arnim and the last organized remnants of his army group officially surrendered. In the end, nearly 275,000 Axis soldiers were taken prisoner. It was a catastrophic defeat for Germany and Italy, comparable in scale to the disaster at Stalingrad just a few months earlier. The entire continent of Africa was now firmly in Allied hands. The bridgehead that Hitler had fantasized about had evaporated, and the cost was immense. The Allies had cleared the way for their next major move, the invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, which would bring the war to the doorstep of Europe. The men who fought and died in those final hopeless days in Tunisia became a tragic footnote in the story of the war, a testament to the brutal consequences when leaders lose their grip on reality and demand the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of their own delusions. Their stand was not heroic. It was a pointless tragedy, dictated from afar. The lesson of Tunisia is a stark reminder that in war, the line between strategic determination and delusional stubbornness can be measured in thousands of human lives. Have you ever heard of a leader so trapped in the past that they sacrifice the present? That's exactly what happened in the final days of the North African campaign during World War II. As the Allied forces closed in on the last Axis foothold in Tunisia, a strange and deadly delusion took hold of Adolf Hitler, one that would seal the fate of over 250,000 soldiers. The year is 1943. The once mighty Afrika Korps, along with their Italian allies, are cornered. Their backs are to the sea, supplies are dwindling, and the combined might of the British and American armies is bearing down on them. From a purely military standpoint, the situation was hopeless. Any rational commander would have considered a strategic withdrawal or an orderly surrender to save their men. But Hitler was not a rational commander. Instead of looking at the maps, the supply reports, or the casualty figures, Hitler looked to the ghosts of history. He became obsessed with a single battle from a previous war. Verdun. To him, Verdun wasn't just a battle. It was a legend, a symbol of German willpower and unbreakable resistance. During World War I, the German army had defended the fortified city of Verdun for nearly a year against relentless French assaults. It was a brutal, bloody meat grinder, but it became a cornerstone of Hitler's personal mythology about German endurance. So, as the crisis in North Africa reached its peak, Hitler didn't see Tunisia. He saw a new in his mind. The dusty hills and exposed beaches of the Tunisian bridgehead could be held with the same fanatical determination. He began issuing orders that were completely detached from reality. He told his general on the ground, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, to hold the line at all costs, to fight to the last man, to never surrender. He expected his soldiers to transform Tunisia into an impregnable fortress, just like the concrete bunkers and trench systems of Verdun. The problem was, this comparison was pure fantasy. Let's break down just how different these two situations were. Verdun, in 1916, was on the European mainland. It was connected by a massive network of railways that could bring in a steady stream of reinforcements, ammunition, and food. The entire German war machine was behind it. The area was heavily fortified with deep bunkers and complex trench systems built over years. It was designed for a long, drawn-out defensive battle. Now, let's look at Tunisia in 1943. It was an isolated pocket of territory on a different continent. There were no railways connecting it back to Germany. The only way to get supplies in was by sea or by air, and the Allies had almost complete control of both. The Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force were sinking supply ships and shooting down transport planes with brutal efficiency. On the ground, there were no fortress-like bunkers. The Axis soldiers were digging shallow trenches in the sand, exposed to constant artillery bombardment and air attacks. Hitler was essentially comparing a well-stocked fortified castle to a sandcastle on a beach with the tide coming in. His insistence on holding Tunisia like Verdun wasn't a military strategy. It was a delusion. He was projecting his own fantasy of willpower onto a situation where willpower alone was meaningless. Bullets, shells, and bombs don't care about mythology. Starvation and thirst aren't defeated by historical comparisons. Astellite, Operation Vulcan tightened the noose. The situation for the Axis troops became a living nightmare. Food and water ran out. Ammunition was so scarce that artillery batteries were limited to firing just a handful of shells per day. Men were fighting with empty stomachs and emptier rifles. Meanwhile, back in his remote headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler continued to demand the impossible. He saw reports of collapsing fronts, not as a sign of imminent defeat, but as a failure of will on the part of his commanders and soldiers. This refusal to accept reality had devastating consequences. Hitler's orders actively prevented any chance of a tactical retreat or evacuation that might have saved thousands of experienced troops to fight another day. He was condemning them to a pointless sacrifice. The soldiers in Tunisia weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting because their supreme leader was obsessed with a battle that had happened nearly 30 years earlier, in a completely different context. General von Arnim and other commanders on the ground could see the truth. They knew the battle was lost. They were sending desperate messages back to headquarters, pleading for either a massive resupply effort, which was impossible, or for permission to surrender. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Hitler's orders were simple and absolute. No surrender. The comparison to Verdun had hardened from a flawed analogy into an uncompromising doctrine. This reveals a deep and dangerous flaw in Hitler's leadership style. He consistently substituted mythology and historical fantasy for actual, practical strategy. He believed that sheer force of will, his will, could bend reality. In his mind, if the soldiers just had enough belief, enough fanaticism, they could overcome any material disadvantage. This worked in political speeches, but on the battlefield, it was a recipe for disaster. In the end, reality always wins. In early May 1943, the Allied forces broke through the final Axis lines. The defense collapsed completely. What followed was one of the largest mass surrenders of the war. With no orders to retreat and no means to fight, entire divisions simply laid down their arms. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. It was a catastrophic defeat, a blow from which the Axis war effort in the Mediterranean would never recover. The Tunisian Verdun never materialized. Instead of a heroic, year-long siege, the final battle for Tunisia lasted only a matter of weeks. It ended not in a glorious last stand, but in a chaotic and humiliating surrender. The soldiers weren't mythical heroes from a Wagnerian opera. They were exhausted, starving men who had been abandoned by their leader's fantasy. This episode is a chilling reminder of how leaders who fall in love with their own myths can lead their people to ruin. Hitler's obsession with Verdun didn't just lose him an army. It exposed the bankruptcy of his entire approach to warfare. It showed that he was not a military genius, but a gambler who was willing to bet the lives of his soldiers on a fantasy. The sands of Tunisia swallowed up not just the Afrika Korps, but also the myth of Hitler's It's a powerful lesson from history about the dangers of dogma and the importance of facing reality, no matter how grim it may be. Welcome back to our series on the pivotal moments of World War II. Today, WWII diving into the dramatic and tragic final days of the legendary Afrika Korps and exploring how its surrender in North Africa sent shockwaves all the way back to Hitler's headquarters in Berlin. This isn't just a story of military defeat. It's a story of delusion, betrayal, and a chilling preview of the Führer's mindset for the rest of the war. By May of 1943, the once feared Axis forces in Tunisia were a shadow of their former selves. Command had passed from the celebrated Owen Rommel to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. But von Arnim inherited a nightmare. His army group was trapped, with the Mediterranean Sea at their back, and overwhelming Allied forces closing in from all sides. The situation on the ground was catastrophic. In many sectors, his soldiers had run out of ammunition. Their tanks and trucks were useless, either destroyed or immobile due to a complete lack of fuel. Food rations were dwindling to almost nothing. The Luftwaffe's airfields, their only lifeline for supplies or evacuation, had been either captured by the Allies or bombed into useless craters. There was no escape, no reinforcement, and no hope. Facing this impossible reality, von Arnim did what any responsible commander would do. He tried to save his men from a pointless slaughter. In secret, desperate communications with the high command in Berlin, he laid out the grim facts. He explained that his troops could no longer fight, that resistance was futile, and he pleaded for permission to surrender. The response from Berlin was swift, unequivocal, and utterly detached from reality. Hitler flatly rejected any notion of capitulation. For him, surrender wasn't a strategic option. It was a moral failing, a collapse of the will to fight. He insisted, against all evidence, that the troops in Africa could and must hold out. He promised them relief that he knew would never come, demanding they fight to the last man and the last Belita bullet. Many of them no longer had. This put von Arnim and his officers in an agonizing position. They were bound by their oath to obey, yet their orders were a death sentence for the thousands of men under their command. Every additional hour of fighting meant more lives lost for no strategic gain whatsoever. The Allied onslaught was relentless. American, British, and French forces were punching through their defensive lines, and the remaining pockets of Axis resistance were being systematically squeezed and eliminated. The soldiers, starving and exhausted, knew the end was near. The choice was no longer between victory and defeat, but between a sensible surrender and senseless annihilation. On May 13th, 1943, after days of agonizing deliberation and witnessing the futility of further bloodshed, General von Arnim made the inevitable decision. He and his senior officers ordered the remaining Axis forces to lay down their arms. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers went into captivity. The North African campaign, which had begun with such spectacular successes for Rommel, was officially over. For the Allies, it was a monumental victory, clearing the way for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. But for Hitler, the news was received not as a predictable military outcome, but as a personal, profound betrayal. When the report of the surrender reached the Reich Chancellery, Hitler flew into one of his infamous, terrifying rages. The scene was one of chaos and fury. He didn't blame the overwhelming numerical and material superiority of the Allies. He didn't blame his own strategic blunders, like his refusal to properly supply the African theater, or his denial of Rommel's earlier requests for evacuation. No. In Hitler's mind, the blame fell squarely on one man, General von Arnim. He venomously accused von Arnim of cowardice, of personal weakness, and branded the surrender an act of high treason. He couldn't comprehend that his soldiers had been physically unable to continue the fight. To him, it was a simple failure of fanatical spirit. This reaction is incredibly revealing. It demonstrates a complete detachment from military reality that would come to define his leadership for the remainder of the war. For Hitler, battles were not won by logistics, supply lines, or superior firepower. They were won by sheer willpower and ideological fanaticism. He believed that a truly dedicated National Socialist commander, with soldiers of unshakable faith, could overcome any material disadvantage. The surrender in Tunisia was, therefore, proof that von Arnim and his men had failed this ideological test. They hadn't been defeated by the enemy. They had been defeated by their own lack of fanatical obedience. This narrative of betrayal by the generals became Hitler's go-to explanation for every major defeat that followed. Stalingrad wasn't a strategic disaster. It was General Paulus's treasonous failure to fight to the death. The collapse in Normandy wasn't due to Allied air supremacy. It was the officer corps' plotting and pessimism. This dangerous delusion had dire consequences. It led him to distrust his own military experts, to promote ideologues over competent professionals, and to issue increasingly irrational no-retreat orders that cost hundreds of thousands of German lives. The fate of the Afrika Korps wasn't just the end of a campaign. It was the birth of a destructive myth in Hitler's mind, a myth that would help pave the road to Germany's ultimate destruction. The soldiers who fought and surrendered in the Tunisian dust were not just victims of Allied arms, but also of their own leaders. Lethal fantasy. The fall of Tunisia in May 1943 wasn't just another battle lost for the Third Reich. It was the moment that set a catastrophic pattern for the rest of the war, a turning point that sealed Germany's fate, not on the battlefield, but in the mind of its leader. This single event, more than any other, reveals the devastating shift in Hitler's wartime command from calculated risk-taker to delusional fanatic. Let's rewind. The North African campaign is over. A staggering 275,000 Axis soldiers, a mix of seasoned German veterans and their Italian allies, lay down their arms in Tunisia. This was one of the largest, most humiliating surrenders in German military history. Any rational leader, any competent general staff, would look at this disaster and immediately call for a serious questions would be asked. What went wrong with our supply lines? Was our strategy flawed? How can we avoid a repeat of this? A strategic withdrawal, a tactical retreat to save men and material for a future fight. These are standard, sensible military options. But Hitler saw it differently. In the smoldering ruins of the Afrika Korps, he didn't see a strategic failure. He saw a failure of will. He saw weakness. Instead of learning that his armies needed strategic flexibility to survive, he drew the exact opposite conclusion: surrender, withdrawal. Retreat. These words were now erased from his vocabulary. They became synonymous with betrayal and cowardice. His reaction was immediate and furious. He didn't debrief his generals to understand the logistical nightmare they faced. He buried them in a barrage of accusations. He screamed that the catastrophe only happened because they lacked faith, because their spirit wasn't strong enough. He was convinced that if they had just held on, just fought a little harder, a miracle would have occurred. This was the birth of his infamous fight to the last man doctrine. It wasn't a military strategy. It was an ideological decree, a death sentence handed down from his remote headquarters. This refusal to accept reality, this detachment from the grim facts on the ground, became the defining characteristic of his leadership from that moment on. The Tunisian defeat was the crucible where his pride and fanaticism were forged into an unyielding, destructive weapon aimed squarely at his own army. And we see this pattern play out again and again, with horrifying predictability. Just a few months later, in Sicily, German forces were put in another untenable position. The logical move was a swift, organized evacuation to the Italian mainland to save experienced troops. But Hitler hesitated, demanding that every inch of ground be held. When the withdrawal finally came, it was a chaotic scramble, not the orderly retreat it could have been. The Tunisia pattern was already in effect. Then, of course, there is the infamous horror of Stalingrad. Even before the Tunisian collapse, the seeds of this doctrine were there. But Tunisia hardened it into an unbreakable rule. The Sixth Army was encircled, starving and freezing, with no hope of rescue. A breakout was proposed. A surrender was requested. Every plea was met with the same answer from Hitler: hold your position. Fight to the last bullet. No surrender. He promoted General Paulus to Field Marshal, not as an honor, but as a grim reminder that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. It was a command to commit suicide. The result was the annihilation of an entire army and a turning point on the Eastern Front from which Germany would never recover. The pattern continues at Monte Cassino, in Italy. German paratroopers were ordered to defend the ancient monastery to the bitter end, leading to its complete destruction and immense casualties in a brutal, grinding battle that ultimately only delayed the inevitable Allied advance. On the Eastern Front, as the Red Army pushed relentlessly westward, entire army groups were declared fortress cities or festi pele. Places like Minsk, Vitebsk, and Königsberg were ordered to be held at all costs. even when completely surrounded. The result was always the same: the encirclement and destruction of hundreds of thousands of veteran soldiers who could have been pulled back to form a more coherent defense line. Hitler's generals were trapped. They saw the strategic insanity of these orders. They knew they were sending their men to certain death for no military gain. But to suggest retreat was to invite accusations of defeatism or even treason. They were forced to carry out orders that were based not on maps or intelligence, but on Hitler's fantasy of iron-willed supermen who could overcome any odds through sheer belief. His leadership was no longer grounded in military logic. It had become a cult of personality, a dangerous delusion where ideological purity was more important than the lives of his soldiers or the fate of his country. The tragedy is that these weren't unwinnable battles from the start. They became unwinnable because Hitler's orders stripped his commanders of their most crucial tools: initiative, flexibility, and the option to retreat and fight another day. He doomed the German army to a series of miniature Stalingrads, battles of annihilation from which it could not recover. The loss of men was catastrophic, but equally devastating was the loss of equipment and, perhaps most importantly, experienced combat leadership. Every division sacrificed in a pointless last stand was a division that could be used to defend Germany itself. So, when we look at the final, apocalyptic days of the war, with the battle raging in the streets of Berlin, we see the ultimate expression of the Tunisia doctrine. Hitler, hidden in his bunker, moved phantom armies on his map and demanded that his people fight to the last, even as the city crumbled around him. He preferred the complete destruction of Germany, Ahi, Turd, Memmering, or Twilight of the Gods, over the shame of surrender. This final, suicidal stand was not a sudden decision made in the throes of defeat. It was the logical conclusion of a pattern that was set in stone 2 years earlier. On the dusty plains of North Africa, the fall of Tunisia was more than a military defeat. It was the moment Hitler's leadership became fatally disconnected from reality. It marked the point where strategy was replaced by dogma, and military command was replaced by ideological fanaticism. The catastrophic end of the Afrika Korps was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint for the destruction of the entire Third Reich.